Hey, welcome. Really good to be here. Congratulations that we are able to be here. I think that's a pretty significant achievement in itself, and congratulations just on making it to Friday, which I'm sure for most of us will feel quite an achievement. Basically, how important is your reputation? And I'm just assuming many of you will have given some thought to this topic before you get here. The only rhetorical question that I'm going to pose this morning is this one, and the answer is reputation is very important, and I will take you through why I think that's the case, and I'm really interested in hearing from you guys about your own experiences and your own thoughts. And one of the things when Zoe and I were talking about this workshop is we really wanted to design something that is interactive. So when I say that's the only rhetorical question I'll ask, I will genuinely pose questions to the group this morning, and I'm really interested in your thoughts, answers and feedback, and I really would welcome you sharing insights and comments, and in fact challenging me, because I do think we'll get a lot more out of it if we had more of a discussion than if I just talk at you for an hour or so. In terms of how we're going to structure this session, so I will talk maybe for around 20 or 30 minutes. I've got 3 areas that I'm looking to cover. So the first is the changing operating environment. That's a very fancy way of saying the old rules when it comes to reputation don't apply anymore, and that active reputation management is even more challenging than ever. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about really kind of what we can do, what you can do in the kind of reputational space now, right here and now, things that you can do in the absence or an issue or a crisis. And then I'm just going to run through some top tips on how I think you can best manage a reputational situation, which may be again an issue. Well, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on crises because they're kind of another thing, but we'll come to that. There will be time for Q&A, so if you haven't had the opportunity to ask a question you'd like to, there'll be plenty of time for that. And then lastly, we'll break into some group work. That's going to be a little bit more challenging because of the need to social distance. But look, don't be too intimidated or worried about that. It's just a little exercise, and hopefully it's an opportunity for us all to apply some of what we'll have talked about in the session to some real world examples, which we've chosen from the not-for-profit sector. So does that all sound good? Good, excellent. Okay, so look, just to kick us off, I'm going to introduce you to a chap called Jeff Upston. Now, full disclosure, I don't know Jeff. From what I can tell, reading about him and looking at some of his posts on Facebook, he lives in Tauranga. I have deliberately described him as a self-appointed road safety campaigner, and that's not me being patronising, that's kind of how he describes himself. And I'm interested in what Jeff has to say, because for the last couple of years I've spent a lot of time looking at and working in road safety and looking at people's behaviour and also how we engage communities around road safety. So what we thought we'd do is we'll play a really short video. It's about 3 minutes. We might only play the first couple of minutes just to give you an idea of Jeff and what he's up to.
Hey guys, Upston here, road safety campaigner, hashtag keep it 100 and maintain our roads. Really simple message. I wish our Transport Minister would listen. It'd be really great. What do we want? We want the road surface to be nice and safe, right? We don't want to hit potholes and bumps and dips and jumps, right? We don't want it. We want the road surface. Sorry, I've got a bit of dog here. I'm out. Blame George for that. We want the road surface to be safe, right? Safer roads. That's what the NZTA is advertising, mate. Safer road. The road surface right here is all bumpy and it's got dips and hey, it looks alright in the video, but to drive it, it's shit, it's rubbish. Right. The NZTA's got $611,000. We have $611,000 to build this wire rope right here, right? And you know what that wire rope's going to do? Right, it's not going to stop. Okay, let's take an example. Right, one of these dips back up here. Truck hits it a bit quick. Tyre blows out. Truck loses control. It's got 50 tons. Right, that truck's veering across the centre line. It's going to run straight over the top of the Suzuki Swift. It's going that way, or the Nissan March is going that way.
Right, so that's Jeff, road safety campaigner. What do we think? Just to show of hands. Quite credible, reasonably credible? Anyone? Yep. Seems reasonable. Not very credible, doesn't really know what he's talking about, wouldn't take much interest. Okay. I think, well, how many people would say they think this is an issue for NZTA, who's obviously in the gun for this? How many, hands up, you think it's an issue for NZTA? Yeah, a few people. Hands up if you think probably not much of an issue for NZTA, they don't need to do anything much about it. Okay.
What's the issue?
What's that, sorry?
What's the issue?
Well, what's the issue indeed? So basically, there's two reasons it's an issue for NZTA. First of all, the video that we just watched from Jeff has been watched and shared over 10,000 times. So it's a lot of people who've seen it and shown an interest in it and are interested in what Jeff has to say. And the second thing is, this is a story, it's just an excerpt of a story that appeared in Sun Live, which is a Bay of Plenty based media organisation. And it's really interesting just to highlight some of the things that have come from the story. So first of all, you've got NZTA instantly on the defensive, having to defend their expenditure on the wire barriers. And most of the story is about the cost of it. And you can't see it, I know, from back there, but it says, road safety campaigner Jeff Upston feels money is being wasted on barriers on the side of road when it should be spent on improving road surfaces. He says all wire rope is good for is preventing the vehicle from going off the road, but it would still hit other traffic if it crosses the centre line. So there's two things that Jeff's wrong about there. So the first of all, remember he talked about the farmer and the farmer's grass? So what you couldn't see particularly well is that there's quite a deep culvert running alongside that stretch of state highway. And it's really common when it comes to death and serious injury for cars to go off the road and into a deep culvert. And because of the impact of the accident, people generally die. That's typically what happens. And with immovable objects, trees, poles, etc. The other thing that Jeff didn't sort of understand about the physics of wire safety rope barriers is that they generally catch vehicles that come off the road, and they absorb the kinetic energy of the accident, so cars don't ricochet off wire rope barriers into the middle of the road. I mean, that's well understood in terms of road safety, science and engineering. Did we hear Jeff talk about that in the interview? No. What else did Jeff say? He said he wasn't an expert. He said he didn't know anything about it. He said he feels that it's a waste of money. Feels it's a waste of money, and that he has a belief that the money would have been better spent on the road surface, right? And yet, we have NZTA having to respond to a media story about it, which I think is kind of illustrative of the operating environment we're in. Right, I'll jump ahead. Okay, so this is what we're dealing with, in essence. The absence of knowledge is no barrier to expressing an opinion, often and loudly, right? That is the reality, right? And there's a bunch of things driving this. We have the rise of media personalities. Anyone name a media personality who often has strong opinions on things? Starts with M. Mike Hosking. 500,000 Aucklanders listen to Mike Hosking every day, right? They are influenced by what he says and what he thinks. The fact that he often doesn't have much knowledge about the things that he waxes lyrical about does not prevent them from tuning into him, and it does not stop him from expressing an opinion. We have seen the reduction in experts. You don't see that a lot anymore. Even if you look at 7 Sharp, 7 Sharp used to be a current affairs program where they would interview ministers, they'd interview people who knew stuff about subjects. They kind of don't do that anymore. They talk about cats and what people think about neighbourhood issues, or nice human interest stories. We've also seen the rise of what I would call advocacy journalism, and that is where the journalist takes a position on a story and advocates for an outcome for a person or people in the story. Anyone think of an example of someone who did a lot of that in recent years? John Campbell, yes. So EQC in Christchurch. Now look, I'm not getting into whether EQC did a good job of delivering outcomes for people in Christchurch or not, but he took a really strong position which was the people who were not getting what they wanted from EQC were right, and EQC was wrong, and that was clearly what he told people every night at 7 o'clock for about 2 years, whether it was right or wrong. The other thing, this won't come as a surprise given the events going on at the moment, but we're seeing the rise of conspiracy theories, right? We're seeing the rise of people saying something, other people believing it and sharing it, and then it kind of becomes this sense of normal and what people collectively view, believe, understand. And also, you know, we know that Facebook and social media posts and things, you know, are readily accessible. People have alerts for all sorts of things. That's where they're consuming their media. I'll touch more on this in a minute, but does anyone has a guess how many people in New Zealand say as a percentage that Facebook is their principal source of news and information? Last time I checked, it was around 40%, which is a lot, right? And for a lot of people, Jeff would be considered to be a source of news and information for them about what's happening in the world of road safety. So it's really something to keep in mind when we think about social media and the role it plays. Okay, so let's just have a little look at the global context. So don't be too kind of intimidated by this slide, but what it kind of does is reflect what I describe as the new world order. So on the left, you've kind of got this old model where you had what we would describe loosely as influence and authority, and the wider population mass kind of sitting below that. And at this top of the triangle of the pyramid, people disseminated information to the unwashed masses. Now, all that's changed, and there's a bunch of reasons that has changed, and I will touch on that briefly. In essence, you see the rise of inequality. You see a really low barrier to entry to the means of mass communication and broadcast. So, you know, basically in America in particular, if you have access to a video recorder or, you know, an iPhone and the internet, you can start a news channel. You can pretty much tell anyone anything you want. There's no checks and balances on it. It's not like a traditional media organisation. And you also have this idea of an echo chamber. I guess, have people heard of this term echo chamber? So there's a couple of things to keep in mind with that. So basically that means that, again, the Mike Hosking example, if your only source of news and information is listening to News Talk every morning, then you are often hearing your own views repeated back to you. So that's what is being reinforced. You're not hearing another perspective, and you're not hearing somebody else say why they might have a different point of view. The other thing is algorithms, right? How many of you regularly look at videos on YouTube, right? How many of you wished you'd never watched that cat video? Like, that's all you get, right? You only get cat videos when you're interested in, I don't know, some diversification of, you know, interest, you know, music videos, but actually what you keep getting served up is stuff you've already shown an interest in. So that's self-repeating. I mean, the other thing here in this kind of idea of democratisation of information, high-profile revelations of misbehaviour, income inequality, all these things are leading to a lack of trust in government. So for the last 40 years or so, we've had this predominant kind of neoliberal worldview, which is driving economic thinking and policy. It's very centred around the individual, what the individual does. The idea is that government is small, government slows down, generally slows down things and makes it harder for people to be entrepreneurial or successful. And we're still sort of seeing the effects of that play out. Although interestingly, with the current COVID situation in New Zealand, you know, people are perhaps revisiting some of those ideals or views and thinking about the importance that government plays in their lives. And you are seeing people kind of see that fundamentally if government doesn't work well and organisations don't work well, then their health is threatened and actually society is undermined. So whether that's an anomaly or whether that may be a bit of a shift in the way people think, it'll be interesting to consider. I would just say that this, I won't spend a whole lot of time about the Edelman Trust Barometer, but it does look globally. It doesn't look closely at New Zealand, and I think it'd be fair to say that levels of trust in institutions in New Zealand are generally higher than a lot of other parts of the world, but we are still seeing a decline. So I think the probably best you could say is that we are behind the curve. So some of what's happening in other parts of the world it's likely that we will see here in New Zealand, although again, coming back to the COVID example, maybe that won't be the case, but it'll be interesting to watch. And kind of lastly on this slide, it's really important to keep in mind this idea of peer-to-peer influence. So by that I mean people increasingly believe their friends, family and work colleagues, and they're less likely to believe, a government minister, a CEO of an organisation, the messaging that they receive from a big, corporate or entity. They'll actually listen to what other people say, and that's what will ultimately influence their views. Okay, so let's just move on to reputation and what it is and how we define it. There are a bunch of definitions around reputation, but I quite like this one, which is essentially, it's most easily defined as what people think and more importantly say about you. And then when we think about how we would define reputation management, so the technical definition that I found is reputation management is the effort to influence what and how people think of a brand or a person. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on brand. In the context of what we're talking about reputation, they are somewhat interchangeable. Sometimes organisations will talk about the value of their brand. Someone like Air New Zealand will talk about the value of their brand. In the context of probably the NGO world and central government or local government, we'd probably more talk about trust and confidence. So reputation translates into whether people have trust in the organisation and they believe the organisation to be doing, the right things. I also think it's really important for the context of this workshop to think about reputation management as knowing what people say about you and also having a view about what you want them to say about you. So how many people would say they had a really good understanding at the moment or just a feel for how valuable or well regarded they were in their organisation? Essentially, what measure, have they got measures around their reputation? Anyone doing anything at the moment to give a sense of kind of how they would be able to articulate their reputational kind of positional score? Don't worry, I won't be asking for examples. Okay, so not too many people. Like maybe it's something you guys are just starting to think about. Why do people think, coming on to that third point, that reputation has value? What are the things that a good reputation actively contributes to your organisation?
Trust.
Trust, yep. And what does trust get you?
Funding.
Funding, yeah, absolutely. If you like an organisation, you trust it, and you think, oh, I know if I make a donation to Gail, I'm going to know where it goes, I'm going to see value from it, it's going to fit with my personal views, ideals, values, leads to funding, right? What else?
Acceptance of change.
Yep. That's an interesting idea. One of the things I would say is if you have a really strong reputation, people have high trust in you, it gives you influence. So people will give you the benefit of the doubt, right? Even if you say, well, we're actually heading over here, well, we were over here, people will say, well, they seem to know what they're doing. Yep, give them the benefit of the doubt. What else? Authority, yeah. And what comes with authority?
Respect.
Yep.
Being the ability to lead and influence others and promote your point of view.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. So that's sort of in that influence territory. The other thing I was looking for, I'm wearing my local government hat, compliance. It's really important, right? I mean, in the Auckland Council context, compliance is everything from people making sure that they meet food hygiene standards, through to returning their library books on time, through to paying their fares on, the bus, through to paying their rates on time. All these things are related to how people feel about their organisation and whether they trust you to deliver what you say you will deliver. It was kind of one other, we might have touched on it, but just general public support. And you can generally see where people are being publicly supported because you will get endorsement from people. People will say good things about you. And that's really important when it comes to reputation. So what's the converse? So if you have a poor reputation or your reputation is in decline, what are the things that you're likely to see? Challenges, yep. So people might openly challenge what you're doing, or detract, from you in a public setting. Again, back to our friends in social media, they might say things about you which are anything but complimentary. What else?
Issues with recruitment.
Issues with recruitment, yeah, that's a really good point. I want to come on to the importance of staff when it comes to reputation in a little bit. So, what's that, sorry? Takes a lot of resource, yeah. Yeah, look, absolutely. In the middle of responding to an issue, it can be extremely resource hungry. And the other thing, I was at a presentation a couple of years ago about the Grenfell Towers and the issues with Central London and restoring trust in the council after that event. And the speaker, who was the CEO, talked about this idea that trust arrives on foot and leaves on horseback. And I thought that was a really good way to describe it, right? And I think the point he was making was actually growing reputation and trust takes a lot of time and effort, and it can be gone overnight. And we'll talk a bit more about that as well. The other thing is, if you're in Air New Zealand, and Air New Zealand have had their challenges this year with COVID, what have we seen happen to Air New Zealand this year? What's that?
Anesthetic.
Yes, yep. Look, don't get me wrong, it's a really challenging environment for Air New Zealand, and there's all sorts of things outside of their control, but there are some things within their control that they haven't exactly knocked out of the park, and we've seen a few things happen. We've seen some really unhappy customers who don't feel that they're getting a good deal, and they're saying anything, everything less than complimentary. The other thing, we've seen their share price tank, right? Now, okay, yep, the share price has tanked because suddenly the value of a Dreamliner is about half what it was, a year ago. But also, people are less confident in the brand, and some of that relates to how it's being run and the public messaging they're putting out. So you can see a significant financial hit if you lose reputation, and in this world of NGOs and not-for-profits, that can be a reduction in contributions. You might see members leave. You might just generally see people take flight from your brand. They don't want to be associated anymore. Resignations, people leave your board, however it might see. So there's real value in your reputation and ensuring that you maintain it. Okay, so what can you do is the good question that we're coming on to. How can you manage your reputation actively? Now, this is assuming an environment that is largely benign, so we're not talking about responding to an issue or a reputational crisis. We're just talking about things that you can think about, between now and the in the event of something happening which might cause reputational damage. Now, the other thing which is really important, I cannot stress this enough. Everything I'm going to talk about is complementary to your organisation being run really well. Or if not really well, at least quite well. And by that I mean, if you have an offering where you provide services to people, or you're an advocacy group, or whatever it is you do, you have to do that well to have a good reputation. You cannot have a good reputation and not do what you do well. Those two things do not work together. So all of this, in the absence of you saying something but not delivering it, will not work. None of that will work. And the other thing I'm going to touch on, and Gail mentioned it, is your employees really matter. And I want to come back to this. So your employee brand really matters, because a lot of people will get their views about you and your organisation from what the people that work in your organisation say about you. Are you a good employer? Do they like working for you? Do they feel that the values and behaviours that you guys talk about are reflected in the way you act? And does it fit with their own values and their own behaviours? Because if you don't get that stuff right, that's really foundational to good reputation. If you don't have those things right, then none of this is really going to help. I mean, it won't not help, but it's going to be secondary, to say the least. Can anyone think, I was just looking at a report which I'll mention in a moment today about some of the reputational issues of 2018 and 19. I know it feels like a really long time ago, but there was a big issue in Australia. Can anyone think of the example? Fundraising. It wasn't the one I was thinking of, but that came up. Banks, right? There was a big royal commission into the behaviour of banks. And a lot of banks, like in a brand sense, to present themselves as working on behalf of the community. You've got a lot of banks in New Zealand who associate their brand with being Kiwi, contributing to New Zealanders' well-being, right? But what happened in Australia is we saw that a lot of their financial services and products actually were kind of downright dodgy, right? And they were really ripping people off. So there's a real disconnect between what they were saying they were there for and doing versus their activities and behaviour. And of course, that is just kind of fundamentally damaging when it comes to your reputation. You have to demonstrate that what you say you're doing is what you actually do. Because if those things don't join up, then managing your reputation will be extremely difficult. Okay, so I'm just going to run through a few of these. So, yes. Yeah, that's a really interesting example, but what we have seen in New Zealand is there's been a change in the regulatory environment. So banks are now obligated by government regulation to change their practice, and the last thing that banks want is more regulation. So look, I agree with you, how measurable is it? A short-term dip in their share price, maybe a hit to the bottom line temporarily. People are very dependent on banks, but then equally you might see other organisations, who appear or emerge from that, who have a different offering. We're seeing, for example, third-party lenders who are kind of peer-to-peer lenders, so they're kind of cutting the bank out. There are things that you'll see on the basis of those banks suffering reputation where people think, hey, there's a better way we can do this. We're not so dependent on them. But look, it's a really valid point. There are certainly organisations who will take the short-term reputational hit because the long-term profit is their driving motive. There's no question about that. So just in terms of these 4 points, so understand and invest in your stakeholders and your community of interest. So kind of hands up, how many people would say they know who their stakeholders are? Good, great. Stakeholders, I won't get into a textbook definition of stakeholders, but I also like this idea of community of interest. So these are people who are in the same space as you. They might be even in competition to you, or they may be running an organisation that's only sort of slightly relevant to you, but broadly speaking, people would think of them as doing the same work, health advocacy, for example, or providing services to the elderly. It's really important that you identify your stakeholders and that you have a connection with them and a means to communicate with them. It's also really important that when you're communicating with these stakeholders, that they understand what your intent is and that you can demonstrate that. So for example, if you say that you're working in the community and you're doing great things for children with disabilities, you might want to back that up with some examples of how you're doing that so that your communication is credible and believable. The other thing is that it's really important with stakeholders is to measure the health of those relationships. Now that might sound like, wow, how are we going to resource something like that? But actually, there are ways and means to do like a twice annual survey, even just through SurveyMonkey, where you ask people a bunch of questions. Just say, how often do you hear from us? Are there things that we're doing that you actually think we shouldn't be doing? Are there things we aren't doing that you think we should be doing? Actually listen to people, get their views on things. And it's also an opportunity to give some thought to how you involve those stakeholders in your organisation and your business. How involved are they? Like, for example, your members, your volunteers. How do they shape your direction? How do you give them a voice in your organisation? When I think, so just coming on to building your communication channels, how many of you would say you've got some communications channels in place at the moment? So it might be a newsletter, Facebook. Good, right, that's really important. Okay. How many of you have done a bit of a stock take or an audit of those channels in the last, say, 6 months? Okay, well, look, the world's changing rapidly, right? It's a really good idea to have some measurement in place of the effectiveness of those channels. And there are simple ways to do this. There's Google Analytics, there's making sure that when you send out a communication that you can check the open rate of emails or a click through to a website. And you also might want to, coming back to that survey idea, you might want to just check your demographics. If you think the future of your organisation is in people under the age of 40, but largely you're only talking to people who are 40 and over, you might find that actually your channels aren't fit for purpose. So what are your channels and are you there? How many people have an Instagram account? Oh wow, okay, I'm really surprised to see that. I don't have an Instagram account. Stephanie has an Instagram account. She tells me about it all the time. But look, this is really important. Are you reaching your hard to reach audiences? And you want to measure what's working for that audience. So you'll get a sense if you look at how those posts or whatever it is that you're communicating, how they perform over time. So what people are interested in and what they will engage with. Again, a video is a really good example. Back to Jeff, how many people would watch a video that you posted and what's the content of it. So something to give some thought to. Thirdly, just ensure you have a consistent look and feel for your communications. It's really easy now to have a professional looking brand. I'm going to use that term interchangeably. Just how do people see your organisation when they see the content or collateral that you produce? Does it look professional? Is it well written? Are there spelling mistakes in it? Some of this stuff really matters in terms of credibility. Also, who's the face of your organisation? Who do people hear from in terms of building that credibility and that trust? And look, there are loads of people around who can do really professional looking design work for not a whole lot of money. So if you don't have that at the moment, it's well worth some investment. The last one on that page is leverage your current reputation to increase your profile. So again, when did you last have a positive news story about your organisation? Is there somebody tasked with looking at those opportunities for you? The sorts of things, and this again might be pretty kind of comms 101, but human interest, often interest from social media, interest from media, any research findings that you guys might have done, a kind of a significant milestone for your organisation. All these things are potentially opportunities to leverage your reputation and have people show interest in what you're doing. And finally, in that point, what is the opportunity for you to add your voice and support to an issue? So coming back to that community of interest in your stakeholders, if there's something that's being discussed topically, now we know in New Zealand we love to talk about housing and we're really concerned collectively about the unaffordability of housing. If you have an organisation that's involved in advocating for people who have housing needs, how present are you in this discourse? Are people coming to you for comment? Are you out there saying, hey, what that organisation said is absolutely right, we support that 100%. So think about those opportunities. You don't have to generate themselves, but you can join the conversation and you can think about telling your story alongside it. Okay, so this is the good times. This is peacetime. These are all the things you're doing when you're on top of running your organisation in a really efficient and professional fashion. But what about when things don't go quite to plan? So what we're going to do in the case studies is we're really just going to look at what I would describe as more kind of somewhere between issue and crisis. And again, we're not going to get a whole lot into what constitutes an issue versus a crisis, but it's easy for issues to become a crisis. That's what I would say. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that you kind of think, maybe not Jeff as an example, but something that seems fairly minor, not a big deal, but suddenly it kind of catches fire and you're like, OMG, how did we get here? And you wished if you had your time over, you did things differently and you see opportunities retrospectively about how you might have avoided something becoming full-blown. And we'll talk about some of the implications of a crisis as we go. There is kind of 4 phases. There is some, it's more of an art than a science, this whole space, but there are kind of 4 accepted phases. So one is the kind of readiness. So we've kind of touched on that. What have you done to grow and manage your reputation to date? So that is a bit like your reputation bank, back to this idea of influence, people giving you the benefit of the doubt. How strong is that? Most people just going to think, oh, well, I saw something on Facebook that somebody said, but actually that's not been my experience. And then this other sort of aspect of readiness is this kind of having a plan. So the 4 phases generally readiness, response, reassurance and recovery. And I'm really just going to talk today about the readiness and response and touch a little bit on the recovery. But those I think are the 2 areas that it's probably most useful to spend our time on. So look, the first one is have a plan. Now, look, that sounds like quite a mountain to climb. It isn't necessarily. A plan can be 2 or 3 pages. It does not have to be massively comprehensive. It should complement your organisational strategy, your business plans, all those other plans that you've got. And fundamentally, what you might want to have in your plan is a couple of scenarios. So think about a scenario that might cause you reputational damage, and think about also what you're going to need in those scenarios. So at a very fundamental level, who might you need in a room for a day or a week to help you manage your way through your reputation? Now, if it's about financial mismanagement, for example, well, you might need your accountant and your CFO and your independent auditors. They might need to be on hand to help you, and you might need access to information really quickly. You also might need somebody who's just really good in a crisis, who can turn their hands to pretty much anything. And you might want to think about just forming a small crisis team. So those are the people that are going to see it out, and they need to be cleared of all their other responsibilities and focus on the crisis. In some organisations, they talk about kind of forming a war room. That might be bigger than Ben-Hur for what you guys are dealing with, but it's worth keeping in mind. You have to have your 100% attention and focus on managing it, because these things can quickly get out of hand. And it's really easy to just think, oh, look, that's somebody else's job, it's not my responsibility. And we'll talk a little bit about how you might own a crisis as well. So have a bit of a plan. As I said, complement your business plans and your other strategies, but talk about scenarios and make sure you've got people identified and they know what their role is in the event of a crisis. Prioritise your stakeholders. I cannot emphasise this enough. Think about those channels you've got, and we'll talk about that in a moment too, but prioritise talking directly to your stakeholders. It's really important that in an issue or an event that has reputational connotations, that they hear from you directly. You do not want them to be hearing a perspective about you from a third party. So a detractor or the media, somebody who is not necessarily going to have your best interests at heart and they've got an agenda. You want to make sure that they are hearing from you, and you also want to make sure that they're hearing from you regularly. Don't send an email on Monday and then find by Friday like the world's kind of caught fire and you never quite got around to sending that email or posting an update. Really important. The other thing I would say, who else is a really important stakeholder here? We've touched on it. Staff, absolutely. So easy to forget your staff when you're, kind of neck deep in something. Get your staff together, do a virtual briefing, explain it to them. In some cases, in the reputational situation, it will be your staff who are under siege. They're the ones who are being challenged or criticised or commented on, and they will want to know you have their backs, you're actively managing it, you are doing your best on their behalf as well. So make sure that they're in the mix. Seek or establish a third-party endorsement. So why do we care about that? We've kind of touched on it. What would be the value of having a third-party comment on your issue? Independent view, exactly. They are less invested. They look like there's somebody who can speak with an independent voice. Any other reason?
And because people believe their peers over the organisation.
Absolutely. Absolutely, there's tremendous value in that. And remember, if you do the using your channels and prioritising your stakeholders well, those guys will be hearing from you, so they'll be really equipped to present your position when they're asked for comment. Remember, if you're thinking about the media, who are they going to go to? They're going to go to your customers, going to go to your members, they might go to people on your board, volunteers, all these kind of people are the ones that are going to be approached, and their perspective will be what matters. Take a position. Now, I kind of can't emphasise this enough either. Now, what I mean by there's kind of 3 accepted positions when it comes to managing an issue or a crisis. Can anyone hazard a guess about what those 3 positions might be?
I'm sorry.
Yes. So I would probably describe the I'm sorry as the kind of embrace position. So you're leaning in to the issue. You're accepting it, you're acknowledging it, and you're generally offering an apology. You stuffed up. You're accepting and acknowledging that what you did was less than ideal and you will do better. So that's position number 1. Anyone got a hazard of a guess of what the other 2 might be? Defend. So defend is another really important position, and there are examples of where people have done a bit of a flip-flop. Can we think of an example this week where someone's flip-flopped on the defend to apologise? Well, yeah. James Shaw. James Shaw is a great example. On Monday, he was absolutely defending the investment in the Green School in Taranaki, and by Thursday, he had completely changed his position. He was apologising. It was the worst thing he's ever done. He really wished he hadn't done it. Now, politics is a little bit different, but as a general rule of thumb, you can only have one position. You cannot have all three. You cannot be defending, then apologising, and then the third position that you potentially might choose is what I would call the explain position, which is actually you might well think that, but if you had some more information or a little bit more context, you would find that what we did was actually completely understandable and acceptable. So think of those three positions. As I said, it's really easy to choose one. It can be hard to stick with it. And the other thing I would say, when you have chosen a position that you're going to take, use language that suits the position. So if you're talking about apologising, we are really sorry. We never intended. We are very aware of the hurt we have caused. Use language that reflects your position, and okay, don't overcook it. But an apology that doesn't sound very authentic or doesn't sound like you really mean it is not a great apology, and people will kind of think, oh, well, they're having to say that because that's the advice they got, but they don't really mean it. Same with defend. If you are really adamant that what you've done was right for your organisation, your stakeholders, whatever, say that. Absolutely use language. We categorically reject the suggestion that this was a poor use of, members' funds or volunteer funds or donations or whatever. Use language that will have impact and will demonstrate that position. Where did I get to? Use your channels, kind of touched on that. Like again, it's really important that you're out there telling people through all those channels and the reach you've got, what's going on and why, and making sure that you are telling your story through those channels. Just going to keep it on time. Be in the story. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in the case studies. Why is it important to be in the story? You absolutely lose control. It's also really hard for people to understand your perspective if you're not in the story, right? Now, it's a bit of a double-edged sword at times. There are reasons why you might not want to be in the story, and there are examples where you will deliberately decline a media interview, and we're not going to get into the ways and means of that today. But as a general rule of thumb, you should be in the story. If a journalist is doing a story about you and you know that it's not going to be positive, you want to make sure that they are providing balance and perspective to that story. And it's really important that you have all of your messages and everything, and you embrace the opportunity to get out there. And the last one, now this may not be quite so relevant for you guys. It's probably more of a kind of a government perspective. But this idea of releasing your own information and on your own terms. So in other words, if there's a report that's coming out about you that you know is likely to be damaging, who's releasing the report? What influence can you have over how the report is made public? Equally, if people are asking you for information and you know that they're looking for examples of your shortcomings or whatever, maybe you should release that information yourself. Maybe you shouldn't let a third party release that for you, because if there's a report that says 80% of what you're doing is great and 20% is not so great, there's a surefire bet that if there's a third party releasing it, that the 20% is what they will put the emphasis on, and that will be their kind of spin on it. So if that's the case, think really carefully about who you're giving information to and what they're going to do with it, and whether or not you might be better to front the issue or get in front of it and release information to support it.